in Kentucky. He is also a board member, collections member, or collections committee member, and a docent at Ashland. So thank you, Dr. Apple, for joining us. We also have Rob DeHart, who is a graduate of the Middle Tennessee State University Public History Program. He was recently appointed as the curator of Tudor Place Historic House and Garden. And we're kind of putting him right to work. He served as the history curator at Tennessee State Museum in Nashville, where he led the development of a permanent gallery on the state's antebellum history. He also serves as peer reviewer for the American Alliance of Museums. So Rob, thank you so much for joining us. I'm actually gonna go ahead and let you start us out here. Why Henry Clay and Thomas Peter? What do these two have to do with each other? And what does that have to do with horse racing?
Okay, well, first, since everybody was talking about where they're from, I grew up in the Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky area, then went to Nashville, was there for 20 years, and now I've just come to DC. So I've been around these circles too. And I grew up with Derby Day being a national holiday. I thought it was a holiday for everybody. It was a wake-up call for me when I moved other places and they didn't have parties every Derby Day. They didn't get off school for the Oaks. Who knew, right? So this is something that's been up my alley for a really long time. And so it was really interesting that my first program here at Tudor Place is going to involve something Kentucky, horse breeding, and we're talking about Washington, DC. But these two guys get together because we have to think about how horse racing functioned in antebellum society. So horse racing is a tradition that came from England. It was especially important in the middle colonies during the colonial period. And for wealthy men like Clay and Thomas Peter, who was the first owner of Tudor Place, owning fine horses and engaging in racing was a way for them to establish their status, to pursue rivalries with other people. It opened up social circles to them. And there was also some economic value in it because the more they could raise their character in society, the easier it would be to borrow money. And that's the thing you really needed to pursue horse breeding. You had to have capital, you had to have the money to buy horses. But the second thing you needed was information, because you needed to at least have someone who understood the different breeds of horses, how to take care of horses, the bloodlines that produce successful racers. And so this is the reason. So this is the reason that Henry Clay gets in touch with Thomas Peter. This is the thing that they have in common, because Thomas Peter is very involved with the DC horse racing scene. And Henry Clay is breeding horses back in Kentucky. He's also going to horse races in DC. And he hears that Dr. William Thornton, who was also a prominent horse breeder here, had passed away. Unfortunately, he passed away with quite a bit of debt. So his widow is trying to sell some of his race horses. And he writes to Thomas Peter in 1829 saying, what do you know about some of these horses, especially the mare named the Duchess of Marlborough? So this is where this relationship starts. And Thomas Peter knows Thornton not only from the racing circles, but Thornton is an architect, had designed Tudor Place, which is the house that I'm sitting in right now. So Clay, that's what starts this relationship. And it's important to realize that Clay isn't just thinking of the short-term value of this, but he's thinking about breeding this mare. So that's why the importance of bloodlines and who has seen this horse is so great, because Clay is hoping to make money with stud fees, and hopefully that this horse might produce some champion racers.
That is really fascinating. I think that the letter that connects these two men is on your website, so maybe we can link to that later in the comments. Dr. Apple, I'm hoping that you can talk a little bit about Henry Clay as a horse breeder.
Okay, I assume you could hear me now.
We can hear you. You sound great.
Yes, Clay started almost immediately after arriving in Kentucky. According to the family, he came only with his license to practice law in his saddlebag. But he knew a number of prominent lawyers in the area because of connections back in Virginia. And he began almost immediately to make connections. He connected to the elite in Kentucky. He married into the Hart family, which was one of the major families here. Probably initially, at least as much for business reasons as anything else, and to get ahead, which he did financially. So by 1806, he was in a position to or help create a syndicate that bought Buzzard, a horse from England, and to bring it to Kentucky. The price was over $5,000. And that had to be an amazing cost at that time. He bred horses sporadically for the next 10 to 15 years. He was interested in them, as Rob said. He did involve himself in racing in Washington, D.C., as well as in Kentucky. But I get the feeling that what he's really trying to do is to create status, to be with the shakers and movers, because that was the people who were involved in the breeding of horses at that time. His three major horses really didn't come until he had turned his stables over to his son John. But he had experimented a lot. He experimented with Arabians. He purchased horses from a number of people that Rob has already talked about, and was very involved in the selective breeding process to try to create the perfect racehorse, if you will. He was, of course, at the same time trying to create the perfect career for himself, and succeeding at that.
That's really interesting that you bring that up, because something we talked about is the science involved in breeding. Where do you think people like Thomas Peter, Thomas Jefferson, Henry Clay, they're so involved in the scientific aspect of breeding? Where did this kind of curiosity and need come from, do you think? And this can go both or either of you.
I
think it came from
go ahead, Dr. Apple. That's fine.
A movement at that. Jefferson was called the American philosophe. He was a part of the Enlightenment, and was curious about all learning and man's capability of learning. Very positive, optimistic period. Well, that's the background that Henry Clay comes from. The man who supported him in the practice of law or the learning of the law, George Wythe, was a Virginian. He was a friend of Thomas Jefferson. All of these people ran in the same circles, and the detail that Clay gave to the breeding says that he was trying to create that perfect horse. The philosophes were attempting to create perfect everything, if you will. We could go into how wrong they were, but at the time it created tremendous change, if you will. And so I think that was the origins of the scientific movement.
I agree totally. And it's interesting to see Thomas Peter. He's kind of straddling both worlds, a little bit of science, but there's also a little bit of myth and legend involved with the ideas with horse breeding as well. The American Turf Register and Sporting Magazine was the premier magazine that these guys used to communicate with each other and to write about horse breeding and racing. And Thomas Peters submitted a couple articles to it. One was about big head disease in horses, which really wasn't a disease, it was really more of a syndrome, which is a lack of absorption of calcium. Today, it's treated by adding lime and sulfates to the diet. So he looked at it as a very scientific thing, but he also wrote an article about trying to how you could influence whether you would get a colt or a filly when you bred your horses. And that was based on the phases of the moon. If you wanted to, I'm trying to remember which one it was. If you wanted a colt, you would want to try to get the breeding happening before the full moon. If you wanted a filly, you want to get it after. And there's some breeders that still kind of believe that there might be some truth to that. So there was kind of this weird science, but also a little pseudoscience thrown in on some of these things as well.
The full moon and the breeding really, really gets me there that they were thinking about that. And it looks like, Dr. Apple, you have switched computers. Is that correct? May have lost him temporarily. I'm going to keep going, and I think Dr. Apple will work with getting things back online. Kind of sticking with this idea of Thomas Peter and horse racing and his submitting articles. Can you speak, and let's start with you, Rob, to the importance of the horse to the economy, to travel, to agriculture, for men like Thomas Peter, and then we'll go to the same question to Dr. Apple and via Henry Clay.
Sure. I guess I would just answer that with that what we're talking about is definitely a very elite activity, although horses had such an important function in all society for all people: transportation, work, farming, agriculture. You can just look at all the side businesses that associate with horsing. I mean, every town has a blacksmith, a saddler, a carriage maker, a stables for taking care of horses. Like if you go to a new city, where do you park your horse? It's not like parking your car. You have to actually have some place where they'll water it and feed it. So there's this whole industry, just like we think of roadside architecture today that is associated with automobiles. It was roadside architecture, but associated with horses because they were so prevalent for everything in society for hundreds of years. I'm sure Dr. Apple can contribute to that as well.
I think you've covered it very well. When I was looking at some of the information, they raised race horses, but they also raised other horses that could be used for carriages and for other purposes. But when they talked about their carriage horses, particularly, it was like a teenager talking about his 1957 Chevrolet back in the 60s. They talked about the gait, and they talked about the beauty of the horse and all sorts of things. But that was the way you traveled, by a horse and some kind of buggy or carriage or wagon or something. And of course, everything had to be moved basically by horse in that time period. So it is the center. And I think that desire, they talk about horse racing being the sport of everyone from kings to the enslaved. And I think that's because people were interested in the speed and the stamina of horses. Maybe it's a little bit like the modern duffer golfer. He watches the pros because they're so good, and he's never going to get there. Well, they look at these race horses because they're so good, but they're never going to have one to pull their carriage or their work cart or that sort of thing.
Dr.
Yeah,
Apple, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Cameron. No, go ahead.
Dr. Apple, you touched on a really interesting point there about who's enjoying horse racing. I think it's kind of the same today, but could you talk a little bit about maybe the difference in experience of somebody who's watching from the track and someone who's doing the breeding of the horses?
It's a whole different process, I think. The person who's breeding the horses, he's a risk taker. It is not a cheap profession today. It wasn't then, because the horse has one purpose, to race. And increasingly over the years, they were very prone to problems on the racetrack. The front legs are very, very unstable. They're carrying an awful lot of weight to be as small as they are. And some of it is that breeding process that was going on. They brought in Arabian horses. One of the things, for example, that Henry Clay liked about the Duchess of Marlborough, the mare, was that she had Arabic blood, the Arab horse blood in her. She was a Godolphin horse, if you will. And so they experimented with all sorts of different things like that.
I think that also brings up something interesting that I'd like to hear a little bit more about when it comes to this, the idea of racing and labor and enslavement and the people who were enslaved and were caring for these horses. I think, Rob, you had some things on that. And then we have a question as well in chat about the people enslaved by the Clay family who were caretakers and managers of the horses owned by the Clays.
Okay, I'll start with that. Yeah, this definitely was a world where slavery fit in. Just like enslaved persons drove the economy of the antebellum South, enslaved persons also drove the horse industry. Enslaved men could begin as horse grooms. They could take care of the horse's daily needs. They could become jockeys. They could become trainers, eventually stable supervisors. Every aspect of a championship horse was often seen to by an enslaved person or a free Black. So it was in the breeding shed where a Black person's opinion actually counted more than a white person's. One of the few places where that could occur. Most jockeys were Black, and it was definitely a privileged position for an African American. If they could get into that position and with the horse breeding, they could probably travel a little bit easier than others. But there was still, you can't look at it like it was a great job or anything like that, because the privilege that these men obtained could just as quickly be taken away. Frederick Douglass remembered a time when horsemen were spared from the work in the fields like some of the other enslaved people, but they could also be whipped if, let's say, the horse didn't race as well, or the horse looked funny, like he didn't think he was being taken care of. Also, enslaved people, they could be allowed to watch the horse race, but there was an example where Andrew Jackson talked about the stake in a horse race could be cash or slaves. So they might be a wager in a horse race. So there were all these really complex, strange, in some cases, dimensions. And I'll just mention one more thing about that, and that's in our collection. We have the sleeve from a coat. It's blue silk that a note was pinned on it from the Peter family that it was a sleeve from one of Thomas Peter's jockeys of his horse. And I would imagine, because the vast majority of jockeys during that period were African American, that this was a Black jockey. But I think it's telling that they don't say the name of the jockey. And unfortunately, here at Tudor Place, we have no idea what the names were of the groomsmen, even though they may have had a very important position here in Peter's and his enslaved community. They still didn't bother to name them. And even in the horse races, some of the sheets and some of the races, they would list the owner first the horse's name maybe second. Sometimes the horse wouldn't even be named. It was more important to know who the horse's sire was, or who the mare was that gave birth to it. They might just have a color and whether it's a colt or filly. So this is definitely a man's world. It's the owner's world. The enslaved people have a very important role in it, but it was still not an easy world to navigate for them.
I would imagine. I did not know that about wagering. That's a really interesting aspect of horse racing that I hadn't considered. There's so many different aspects throughout this. So Dr. Apple, if you could also address the question about the people enslaved by the Clays and their role in horse racing. I think that'll be a really interesting parallel there too.
Yep. Unfortunately, as Rob said, there's very little information. They're trying very hard at Ashland to find more information on the lives of enslaved people there, but it's a difficult process. Henry Clay built his own racing track. I'm sure the most of the work was done by enslaved people. There was no one else to do it. He had enough slaves at any given time that a number of them would be involved in slavery. We know of one occasion when he had an enslaved person take one of his horses to a new location, and you know, in a closed society, it was very difficult for the slaves to do anything that would lead to slavery. Everybody knew everybody. And if a slave was out off of the property where he was enslaved, then other people would be asking questions or reporting where he was. So, you know, they knew that when they were told to take a slave to a horse to the farm of John Breckenridge, for example, that's what they did. And then they would come back. You know, we know that on several occasions Clay advertised for runaway slaves, but most of the time, you know, it was enslavement of the mind as well as the body, I suspect, and they just walked back to the plantation.
I
Dr.
think.
Apple, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Cameron.
I see this question that Dr. Apple is answering from Sarah in the chat. Thank you so much for that question. And I got some information just a couple of days ago from our curator, Eric Brooks, who's in the audience today. And Eric, you can obviously chime in the chat if there's something you can straighten out of what I'm saying. But we do have a couple of names of people who were enslaved by Clay who are working with horses. But like Dr. Apple said, kind of few and far between. So we have the name of a man named John. He's written about by Henry Clay in 1850. And then a man named Peter Boyd, who's written about by Clay in 1851, just a little while before Henry Clay's death. So Sarah, hopefully we can get with you. I see you put your email in there. Hopefully we can get with you and chat after this. Be great. Thank you.
I really like this interesting contrast that we've talked about. I mean, I've learned a lot about just how entrenched in society horse racing was, but maybe we could speak a little bit to the contrast between the people who owned these racehorses and those who watched or who worked. It sounds like there's quite a divide there, and really interesting separation of those two things. Dr. Upper and Rob, if you'd like to speak a little bit to that, especially when it comes to the Peter and Clay families.
Oh, okay, I can start. Yeah, as we've been talking about, you'd have to be really elite and very wealthy to be able to race these horses. But the horse races as far as spectators, it was the great equalizer. I mean, there were people from all walks of life. It was really a place where people that normally never would have been in the same space were in the same space. Men from rich, poor, black, white would bet on the races, and stuff like this is like the great equalizer. It's just like today when you all root for the same team. It's like if you're all betting on the same horse, you're brothers and sisters for that particular moment. Then when the race is over, then all that's over with. But at least for that moment, and this is the time of what was called Jacksonian democracy, which is a lot. We can have lots of debates about what that really meant. But the truth is, in a lot of places now, a younger, less propertied electorate was there, as far as a male electorate anyway. So for elites trying to gain the favor of ordinary guys was more important than it was, like, let's say, during George Washington's time. So I think this works into it as well. We also must say it's very much a man's world, because women were not supposed to be involved with finance or money or wagering. So they definitely were not part of this betting world. To them, they could be spectators, and there was a whole other horse world for them with their side saddles and a type of clothing that was very specific, at least for elite women. So that's even a whole nother, you could have another conversation about that with women and horses, with just what their role was and the things that went with that, what was expected of them with horses. It certainly wasn't betting on horse races.
Bryn has reminded us that hats are part for women. So thank you for reminding me of that, Bryn. One of the questions also that came up that is tied into this idea is, today's horse races are a social event. Was this the same? Was this also true in the time that Thomas Peter and Henry Clay were corresponding and writing about horses?
Yes, I think very much so. Maybe even more so, because the communities were smaller, and when a race was on, it just was there to reach more people. It was some of the limited entertainment that people had. I might also mention that the races were a lot longer then than they are now, and sometimes there would be two races in the same day, two heats for the horses. And so, people came out and just enjoyed them, rooted on their favorite, I assume rooted for jockeys, because they would be basically local people at that time.
Oh, so a jockey did not travel with a horse?
Not, I don't know, would be the best answer. I'm not sure of that.
I think it's interesting what a big spectacle and ordeal this is. But then there's so many gaps in what we learn. Certain names aren't recorded of those that are enslaved and caring for the horses, and certain ins and outs of horse racing are not included. This is one that interests me in particular. Given the recent accusation of cheating by the winner of the Kentucky Derby, can you speak to any historic horse racing and cheating or horse enhancing that may have gone on as well?
Horse enhancing. I like that.
Horse enhancing, yeah. I coined that.
The tattoo on the inside of a thoroughbred's lip is there for a reason. There was a problem originally of people substituting a better horse, and calling it by the name of the horse it was supposed to be racing.
That like horse
eventually
counterfeiting?
They got to where they just literally horse counterfeiting. They tattoo a number in each thoroughbred so that they can check them and make sure they're right. I can't imagine there being a lot of doping of horses, because there wasn't a lot of drugs available at that time, I wouldn't think. But you know, I think probably the substitution of horses is the biggest cheating thing that would have gone on in that time. There may have been others as well.
I'm really interested to hear about pedigree. That's something that we still talk about. There's still racehorses descended from, you know, Henry Clay's racehorses. So I wonder if you all could talk a little bit about that. I think Lady Marlborough and maybe even Seabiscuit and Man of War have similar or have the same bloodlines.
Man of War is the grandsire, the grandfather of Seabiscuit, I believe. Yeah, it's boy, you know, if it started out as a science, it certainly hasn't continued as one. It's anything but exact. A horse that is a champion on the race circuit will prove not to be adequate in the stud barn, and a horse that, well, that's a good example. Man of War was a huge horse, very large. Seabiscuit is a little fellow. That was one of the reasons it took so long to get a chance, was he was so small, nobody believed he could win. And yet they come from basically the same line of horses. So, you know, it's an inexact science to this day. You don't know what you're going to get. We had
if you watch the Kentucky Derby or more recently the Preakness, Dr. Apple, I think there was a horse in there that was descended from a Clay horse, Midnight
Yes.
Bourbon. You want to talk about that?
Midnight Bourbon, who comes up through the Margaret Wood mare, and there have been 4 or 5 Derby winners, 1892 to 2000, 1901 with Alan Adale, the 1980s, Gato del Sol. There are a number of I think 11 Derby winners that have come through. Basically, the 3 horses that were given to Clay as gifts after he lost the election of 1844, and Yorkshire, Margaret Wood, and but it seems to have died out in recent years. We haven't had much success with this Clay horses.
So I see a question I almost missed in the chat, so keep them coming in the chat, about the colors that horses would wear. Did the Peter family have racing colors?
But we have a blue. we have a blue sleeve, so we can say blue, you know, at least on one jockey, but that's all we know.
Yeah, whatever color Washington used, they probably would have used. Right?
It's a really pretty piece. It just has these very fine stripes. I mean, it's an amazing shape. I know Bryn would know. I mean, for a piece of silk, as we know, usually we see so many museum collections where silk is shattered. This thing's in amazingly good shape.
Yeah, textiles are one of those fragile things that don't always survive. So the fact that a sleeve survived is pretty.
Yeah.
Pretty.
The way it was made, also, like, not to butt it on this, but the way it was made was very sturdy, which is also interesting. I mean, it makes sense because it's a very athletic thing to be a horse jockey, but it's in like amazing condition and very well made.
Wonder if it was like Olympic podium where you wear a nicer outfit for the podiums, and it was meant for show. So I also have a couple questions in the chat. I'm gonna continue to feed them to me, and I'll continue putting them out there. But what was the age of the horse races? Were they 3? Would they have been 3-year-olds typically? in their prime, which I think is the age about now that they do it.
In that day, they were older horses. They didn't run 3-year-olds. You know, a 3-year-old can actually be 2.5 because every horse was born in January of the year. So he turns 3 in 3 Januaries. Whether he was born in March or maybe April, but you know, that was a long process that they went through to get the horse, the 3-year-olds. They were really interested in racing older horses initially.
And another question that came in is how was the race run? Were they straight, or were they like we see now, like in the Triple Crown, where they're in the oval circle configuration?
They were, I mean, most of the tracks here in DC were circular. But as Dr. Apples mentioned, it was often 2 horses. The multiple horses, about what time did that start to occur, Dr. Apple? Do you know?
Yeah, I really don't. It would have, I think it would have been before the Civil War, but I don't know the exact timing of that. As you said, it was usually be 2 horses. It might be 4 horses. Again, going back to an earlier question, one of the reasons that you have rules now about that disqualify horses is because they were really rough originally. They would hit each other. The jockeys would hit each other. They would run their horses into each other, cut in front if they could. And so those were some of the issues that came up. Early on, they ran some races straight and then back. And then very quickly, the oval track became the standard. And I would say that was probably true. Henry Clay's track that he built for training purposes was oval, and that was early on. So obviously, if he's training on an oval track, that's taking over as the major.
More room for spectators that way, right?
Possibly, yes.
Yeah, you have a whole middle section there. Where I've got a question about DC racing, and where were the tracks in DC?
The second one that was there for the longest was Meridian Hill, where that park is, south of Columbia Heights. There was also one really close to the White House at first, that got taken out by, like, around Lafayette Park. I think there was that one that close. And Andrew Jackson had stables built because he was a huge horse guy in Tennessee. He killed a guy over a horse race in Tennessee in 1806. So, you know, that was Jackson. So he built those stables. So, but the one that I think of that was here for the longest was in that area around Meridian Hill Park.
Well, since we're talking about Andrew Jackson, I have a note to remember to bring up donkeys and the importance of donkeys. And we talked a bit about this when we met earlier, and I just want to have a conversation about donkeys.
Well, let's see. So, Dr. Apple, what is it? A donkey plus a horse equals a mule, right?
Right. Right.
And those were very important farm animals. And we were always talking about thoroughbreds, but George Washington, he also was really concerned about the quality of work animals, farm animals in America. You know, that people like Washington, Jefferson, that was their big goal. They were like, how can we bring the quality of everything that we see in Europe to here in America? So they brought the thoroughbreds, but the farm animals lagged behind. So Washington worked on importing donkeys from Spain, which were supposed to be some of the largest and some of the best donkeys. And he was very successful in breeding those and breeding mules. And we know of one case where Thomas Peter had a descendant of one of these donkeys and was charging stud fees. Sometimes the stud fees for some of these donkeys would be almost as much as a thoroughbred. So it often gets overlooked, but that was is a very important part of the economy, and to be able to breed very quality mules, quality donkeys is very important.
Clay did the same thing. He imported, they were called Maltese donkeys, but they may well have come from Spain. And his son, Henry Clay Jr., sent some back when he was in Europe on one occasion. But he raised mules for the Southern trade. You plow cotton with mules. And so he raised hemp for bagging and for rope. He raised hogs and sent the pork south to feed slaves. Also sent it north, but you know, he was into that southern cotton economy and agriculturally and supporting it. And that was why he began to bring the donkeys in. And
we're gonna see if there are any more questions in the chat. If you still have questions, go ahead and put them there. Eric Brooks, who's our curator and has been doing great research, he's chiming in the chat. So we've got some cool information there about Clay's Kentucky Derby winners, or the horses descended from Clay's horses who won the Derby. We also, I'm hoping that maybe one of you can talk a little bit about harness racing. It's something that I think we still have today, like at the Red Mile racetrack in Lexington. But what's the difference between, you know, the thoroughbred racing that we see at the Derby or the Preakness or Belmont Stakes and harness racing?
Harness racing, Dr. Apple, aren't those trotters or American saddlebred? They're a different type of horse.
yeah, standard bred, they call them.
Yeah. And it was popular after the Civil War is when it really
Yeah.
took off. I'm not exactly sure why though. Do you know why it did?
Oh, no, not particularly. I can make an assumption, and that is that both armies in the Civil War stole as many thoroughbreds as they could. Cavalrymen wanted to ride thoroughbreds, and they almost decimated the horse industry. It took a while to build it back, the thoroughbred industry, to build it back. Of course, you could say they probably stole standard breds too, but there weren't many of them in the South until just before the Civil War. They began to build it up. James Clay, Henry's son, introduced the harness racing to Kentucky. And he was, the thoroughbred breeders did not like that at all. But because he was a Clay, he could get by with it.
Yeah, I know it was big in DC and after the Civil War, but I think you're right. I don't think people realize how much the Civil War, just not only horses, but just livestock in general, how it just destroyed, especially in the South, just all the stock that was down there. It took a long time for that to recover. So actually that makes sense.
Yeah, it was 1900 before hogs, for example, reached their pre-Civil War numbers, and cattle weren't much better. I don't know the exact statistics. I had them at one time, but it's just unbelievable what it did. And yeah, I always told my students, if you have cavalry officers racing down on you at 35 miles an hour or 30 miles an hour, are you going to shoot at the man on the horse or at the horse? So many horses died because they were as much the targets as the men on them. If a horse dropped at that speed, it was going to take care of the person riding it as well. It was just a horrendous loss of the major animal categories. You know, you have an army of 65,000 marching on foot and the quartermaster corps is if it exists at all, which is debatable, isn't there. What are they going to do? They're going to kill anything that moves to feed themselves, and that's basically what happens in the period.
We do have another question from in the chat. Tim has asked about importing horses from other countries. So, for instance, he notes that William Thornton got horses from North Africa through the U.S. consular officials. So were there other horses? Clay did this. Did Thomas Peter do this? Did they import horses from other countries?
Clay bought Stambul, which was an Arabian that had been given to an American diplomat. And of course, they couldn't keep gifts. He was given 4 horses, but Clay only bought one of them. Buzzard was from England. They brought in the Virginians brought in a lot of English horses early on. And there was some of that in Kentucky later, but less than Virginia, I think.
Yeah, I don't think we have any record of Thomas Peter doing that. I think he bought all his horses here, but yeah, I've seen that too with William Thornton and the Arabians. I think that was the appeal there.
Mm-hmm. They thought Arabians
for those of you
would create a stronger horse. It really didn't work out as much. Although Godolphin was one of the leading Arabians, and his bloodline comes into the thoroughbreds and is very important. And there are others as well.
And for those of you who might not be familiar, the Thornton is the architect of the original architect for the United States Capitol building in DC, and a family friend of Thomas and Martha Peter. In fact, he designed Tudor Place for them. And his wife, Anna Maria, was actually standing in Tudor Place during the War of 1812 and 1814 when the British burned the Capitol. So Anna Maria is standing inside one of her husband's buildings, watching another one of them burn, which is pretty incredible. So the Thorntons are connected in this same horse racing world as well, especially in the DC world too.
That reminds me, this is not Tudor Place related at all, but when I was at a historic house in Nashville, Travelers Rest, and they had bred Arabians in the 1930s, and that scientific horse thing, the owner was like that they had this prize Arabian named Geharafet that died, and they wanted to see if you could find out why are the Arabians so great, so they donated it to the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And I inquired up there in the 2000s, they still had it. They still had the horse skeleton up there. So just an example of how these horse breeders, the way they think, what they think is important and what knowledge they think that might be derived from certain things that we might not think about.
We've also got a question about where horse racing would have been biggest in the U.S. during, Thomas and Henry Clay's time, or Thomas Peter and Henry Clay's time. Like, would that have been Kentucky, Tennessee, maybe, Maryland, DC, New York, and it might be different based on volume, but
I don't know. I think New York, it seems like where some of the biggest races happened. There were a lot of regional races like North versus South. There was a lot of politics involved, and it seems like all those horse races took place in New York. Even there were some in DC, and of course there were obviously big races in Tennessee and Kentucky, but it just seems like everything flows through New York. What do you think, Dr. Apple?
Yeah, I think you're probably right. Kentucky was competing. They were trying to replace Virginia in the breeding of horses. And over the period of Clay's life, they did so or came very close to it. But in terms of racing, it tended to be, I think New York was probably the leader at that time. Because I can remember there are letters that show that Clay was taking horses to New York at times. His son, even more so, when he took over the stables. So
Yeah, I think, and same with
Orleans
Tennessee.
there too. There were races in Louisiana as well.
And what I think Tennessee would have been competing with Kentucky for horse racing prominence if it wasn't for the anti-betting legislation that passed in the early 1900s in Tennessee. And the same thing happened in DC. That's what killed the industry here as far as racing, you know. So then I don't know, what can you say? Those Puritan politicians from there, those progressive Puritan politicians, they kind of ruined it for a lot of people.
Kentucky had to fight that battle too on a couple of occasions.
Yeah.
But, and the Clays were right up there arguing against it. Even the women got involved. They were writing letters to the editor and saying, you know, how this could not be. And but it was a very big issue here. But the horse industry won out, as it usually does in Kentucky.
Good for you guys.
Still.
Yeah.
I'm a little disappointed Philadelphia wasn't the center. There's a big street, one of the major streets there is Race Street, where the stables were. No? Okay.
It's famous for some other things, a couple other things.
Just a few other things, but
Yeah.
I know everyone thinks New York's the center of early American history. It's Philly.
You wanna tell everyone where you're from, Hillary? You wanna bring up where you're from?
I think it's obvious. I'm a big fan of Philadelphia. So.
I have one more question. If obviously people want to ask something in the chat. You know, women have come up a few times in this conversation, and maybe not during Clay's time, but I know that there are some strong Clay women who are involved in the horse racing industry. And I would love to hear a little bit about some of them. I think Dr. Apple, you might have a little bit of insight into some of these women. Can you talk a little bit about them?
Yeah, you're talking about Josephine. John Morrison, Clay's wife, he was considerably older than she was, and when he died, she took over the stable and produced a number of winners, a number of good horses. She could not be a member of the Jockey Club because she was a woman. Well, I'll get to that in a moment, but she did go down to the Phoenix Hotel in the center of Lexington and sit around and talk to horse owners, and they included her in their conversations about the breeding of horses and that sort of thing. At the same time, had she been on any farm but her own, almost any farm but her own, she would not have been allowed in the breeding sheds or the foaling barns, because it was believed that the presence of women created birth defects in the colts. Now, it was a female horse that was having the colt, but that was their belief. And that was true up into the 20th century. The sons could go to the foaling barns or the stud barns, but not the girls, not the women. And it's just so interesting that we would go to such extremes to maintain our masculine control over things.
I think that's interesting because I'm thinking about like the Crown and Queen Elizabeth and her interest in horse racing, and that more than one member of the royal family has competed in the Olympics in horse in equestrian, but they grew up around horses, spent time at the stables too. So I think it's an interesting, later in time, but an interesting difference there. Another question that came in the chat that I don't know if there'll be an answer to, but I'm going to put it out there because I in particular find it very interesting. Is there any truth to the story that when his horse lost to one owned by Thomas Jefferson, Washington sold it to Harry Lee, Robert E. Lee's father? Now, what I find interesting is I don't know about this question is also that a member of Washington's family did marry into Robert E. Lee's family. So it could be an all in the family thing. It was not out of spite or anything. It just could be selling racehorses among family members. But I think that's an interesting rumor story.
Don't know. Sorry.
Yeah.
I don't know, but a horse probably shouldn't lose more than twice, or he's going to be sold.
Yeah.
It's high. It's possible.
Yeah, and it may have had nothing to do with that, but more about just within the family, selling it within the family too, or within future family, depending on the time period in which this is happening.
I mean,
A story. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say it could have truth to it. Horse racing was very political. If you look at the names, there were some horses named Martin Van Buren, Thomas Hart Benton. I mean, it got really weird with what they even named some horses. So I wouldn't be surprised.
So apparently, Thomas Jefferson had his secretary present in Congress because his horse was racing. So it clearly was part of everyday life and part of everything, and important as well.
And these elite members of Washington, they were moving in pretty tight circles, and they all kind of had similar interests, right?
They were frenemies. That's what we call them today.
That's for
All right, this is the last call for questions because I really think we should end this conversation on frenemies. I think that we've peaked, donkeys and frenemies. We have peaked. Well, thank you all. I'm going to go ahead. Thank you all for having this conversation with us. And if you'd like to learn more about Tudor Place or Ashland, I'm going to put both links to our institutions in the chat. The link I just popped in is for membership at Tudor Place. So if you'd like to become a member, we do programming year round. We're slowly starting to reopen. And if you're on our list, you'll get lots of emails about what we're doing virtually and in person. I also popped the homepage for Ashland, the Henry Clay estate, into the chat as well. So you can check in on Ashland as well and learn more about the programming they're doing. They are also open, and you can look at how to do those reservations there as well. And thank you everyone for participating, for such great engaged questions. I really appreciate having this conversation together.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you everyone. It was just a pleasure, Dr. Apple, to work with you.
I hope to visit you one of these days soon.
Same here.
Thank you.